Hello, everyone. So yes, if you didn't see me earlier, I'm Jenny Tennyson. I'm CEO of the ODI. And in this first panel, we're going to be looking at the impact of technology and data on trust. I'm really pleased to be joined by this really excellent set of characters that we have here. Going from the end, we have Pat Fagan, who's a behavioural scientist at BrainChimp, who used to work at Cambridge Analytica. We have Steve Wood, the Deputy Information Commissioner at the ICO. We have Catherine Miller from Doteveryone, and Andrew Eland, who runs engineering at DeepMind Health. So, trust. Why are we talking about trust? It seems to me that trust is at the heart of many of the conversations that we're having about data. We have privacy activists asking why on earth people are putting so much data into Facebook or Google, why they're trusting those big organizations with data about themselves. We've got commercial organizations wondering how to preserve the trust of their customers while targeting them with marketing. We've got people worrying about trust in public institutions and in the democratic process. We're working ourselves up to trusting AI to help us make decisions. We've got companies working out which other organizations they should trust to share data with. And we have concerns about news and information and what news and information people could trust. So there are issues of too much trust, too little trust, trusting the untrustworthy and distrusting the trustworthy. And this is having a massive impact in our lives, in our democracies, and as we're seeing playing out at the moment. So this panel is going to help us explore at least some of those issues. To start us off, I'm going to just ask, I'd like to just hear about your perspectives on trust. Maybe, Steve, can we start with you? How do you think about trust in data?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jenny, and I'm very, very pleased to be here today. So I'm going to come from the perspective of the ICO. For those of you who don't know us, we're the UK's independent regulator of data protection law, the GDPR, which most of you will know. I think in terms of tackling trust and understanding the sort of complexity and dimensions of the issues, I think the first thing I'd say as well is this is a global problem. It's not just a UK problem. Speaking to our counterpart data protection regulators around the world, we recognise the common challenges and the common issues which have been faced in many countries around the world. I think the other thing to acknowledge as well is that this is a complex problem in terms of the range of actors which are involved in this space, and it's not just about the big tech companies. That's clearly where often the conversation starts, and they have a vitally important role with the range of data they collect about us and how they analyse and use that often to provide targeted advertising. But one thing we've learned in the last year with a number of the investigations we've undertaken at the ICO is the complexity of the data ecosystem involving many different players. So it's about data brokers, data analytics companies, it's about researchers, it's about all of these different players in the system coming together in terms of how data flows and how different harms relating to privacy can sometimes emerge. In terms of understanding the dimensions of trust, I think one thing we would acknowledge at the ICO is that research is really important, and deep research and sort of sustainable research, which is done over time to track the problem, is really important. So one thing we've done at the ICO for a number of years is to undertake an annual track survey where we've looked at a number of different questions around trust and confidence. So for the ICO, in our sort of foundational strategy, which is called our Information Rights Strategic Plan, which is really how we deliver against the statutory functions we have to protect individuals' data and regulate the law. Increasing trust and confidence that people have in how their personal data will be used by organisation is one of the key goals that the Information Commissioner, Elizabeth Denham, has set during her time as Information Commissioner. And the most recent survey we undertook actually indicated a rise in terms of the trust and confidence that individuals had in how organisations use their personal data. So it actually rose from 21% to 34%, which perhaps bucks the trend and is quite interesting. Clearly, it's only 1 year's worth of data, and it's one survey. in terms of some of the interesting features of that, public sector bodies were at the top in terms of the most trusted organisations. Social media companies were at the bottom of the ladder in terms of the level of trust there. And certainly, I think in terms of green shoots, what we're observing at the ICO, we need to do more research on this, is the role of regulation, the GDPR, is perhaps growing now in actually playing a proper strategic role in increasing trust and confidence in how personal data is used. And certainly, I think, to echo what Sir Tim Berners-Lee said earlier on the stage, that there is a real opportunity, I think, now going into 2019, that sort of awareness and interest in personal data is mainstreaming. I mean, that's something we're starting to observe in speaking to data protection officers around the UK at the moment, in how people are actually engaging with their rights in terms of data protection, that's actually sort of changing. We've always seen people who are activists who are particularly concerned about accessing their own data and exercising their rights. And people would often used to do that if something went wrong in their lives, perhaps their credit score was wrong. But we're increasingly seeing numbers of people who are genuinely interested just to know what data is held about them, and often then to make requests for data to be deleted, for example, when they have concerns about data perhaps they didn't expect to be there and how it was being used. So there's a mainstreaming there in terms of awareness, which I think is a really positive trend, and there's more work to be done on that. In terms of trust, though, we know it's a really difficult area in terms of online harms. We've also done a further piece of research with Ofcom, looking at online harms more broadly, with privacy being a component of that. And 79% of the people polled in that research were concerned about going online. 45% of the people said they had actually been subject to some form of harm online, and 21% had reported it. So there are a wide range of harms out there, from economic harms in terms of identity theft, hate crime, the threats from disinformation, and the threats to democracy. So all of these harms, I think, are real, and they're building, and privacy is just one component of that. So is there a major sort of crisis of trust at the moment? It's difficult to say whether we're in a crisis, but I think we're in a tipping point of awareness and really needing to make some really significant steps if we're to actually gain the value that we know we can receive from technology and how data is used to enrich people's lives, from across the commercial sector through to public services.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm always interested when there are those kind of statistics about how little people trust various organisations, about how those actually translate or don't translate into people's actions. Pat, maybe you can kind of from a behavioural scientist point of view, does it matter that people don't trust organisations? Does it change their behaviour?
Yes and no. So as I'm sure you know, there's kind of the rational and there's the emotional side of decision making and processing. So yes, trust is a very, very emotional thing, and we know from ultimatum games that people's natural disposition is to trust, but once that's violated, that's it. And even if they feel that they've been unslighted, they'll perceive that unfairness, even if it's a punishment to them. So if they feel that a social media company has wronged them, they'll stop using it, even though they'll lose out on all that social fun and engagement they had. And we have a very kind of strong, hardwired aversion to creepiness, to feeling that we're being tracked and there's somebody out there and we don't know what their intentions are and what they know about us. But on the rational side, data privacy in particular is very hard for people to kind of get to grips with. It's very abstract. In our evolutionary history, we've been dealing with numbers for a very relatively short time, let alone data and terms and conditions and things like that. So it's just not something that we kind of are able to naturally and intuitively deal with. And the emotional triggers of seeing a friend get engaged on Facebook, or seeing if that person you have a crush on has updated their status and things like that, is always going to be a more powerful driver than concerns about data, I think.
So turn to you, Catherine. Doteveryone have run surveys around trust in technology as well. What are the kind of conclusions you're drawing out of those?
Well, the work that we did was coming up for a year ago, so I think Steve's stats are probably more recent, and we certainly did our work before the Cambridge Analytica scandal erupted, so I think that probably influences. I think The stat that I would focus on from the work that we did was we asked people about the impact of the internet. So not particularly about data, but about the impact of the internet. 50% of people said the internet had had a very positive impact on their lives as individuals. Only 12% of people said it had a very positive impact on society. And what came through in our research was this very strong sort of ambivalence of I'm getting so much out of these technologies as an individual, but they're changing the world around me in a way that I feel very uncomfortable with and which I'm not able to keep up with. And actually one of the, coming to the point about regulation, is there is a sense like no one has my back on this. So in the focus group work we did that followed up on this, one of the things people said was, it feels like there are no rules in this, or what rules there are for written by the tech companies. You know, there's an ombudsman for my pension, but who's the ombudsman for the internet? So there's a sense that people are kind of grappling with technological change very much on their own, without any social infrastructure around it. And I think one of the difficulties when we start to talk about trust is that we tend to talk about trust very much from an individual perspective. So taking your example of social media, if my personal Facebook data was scraped by Cambridge Analytica, that actually hasn't changed my life in any discernible way. The impact on democracy as a social harm is something that I care about deeply. And I think when we talk about trust, we need to start to find language which bridges this difference between what happens to me individually with my personal data, which may be of greater concern, for example, around the use of my health records, and what happens with my aggregated data changing the way that society functions around me, and how do we quantify that change both positively and negatively.
Very interesting, thank you. So, Andrew, last person on this kind of framing question. So, I'm going to bring up Streams. So obviously last week then we heard that Streams, which was an app built by DeepMind Health, was moving over to Google, and I know lots of people were concerned about that. How do you think trust kind of plays into that whole situation?
Well, I think everybody here understands that data has tremendous power to have a positive impact on society. And we've already seen that in everywhere from healthcare to transportation to energy. And we've always tried to play a part of that. And many organizations, such as my own, have basically built a business around processing data on behalf of others and under the instruction of others. And trust is incredibly important to that because, as Bea mentioned earlier, if we lose the trust of the partners that we work with, individuals will simply opt out of using services. Organizations will fail to renew contracts with us. Yeah. And so maintaining that bond of trust is crucially important for businesses in that space. I think as DeepMind Health, we've tried to innovate in this space because I think we have not yet, as society, worked out what the best model of governance and regulation is for data in this space. We have to ensure those things continue as we move closer to Google. And that's something that will be evolving in the future. If anything, our recent announcements was an attempt by us to be transparent and let people know in advance of things is happening so we can actually have these debates before anything actually changes, because at the moment nothing on the ground has changed.
Right. Okay, so you brought up we don't know what the future kind of regulatory landscape or governance landscape should be around that. Let's explore that a little bit. What in your opinion as a panel, what should a good future look like? If we have this amazing kind of future where the right organizations are trusted and trustworthy, what does that look like? Catherine, maybe you can start us with a kind of big picture and then hopefully other people can chip in.
So Doteveryone's a think tank, and our mission is to champion responsible technology for a fairer future. So essentially this exact point. And we define responsible technology as technology that supports a fair, inclusive, and thriving democratic society. So that's, hard to disagree with, I guess, but that's essentially what we're aiming with. And one of the things we talk about is how do we make responsible technology the new normal? So this is just how things happen. And to create a new normality, a new way of a new set of cultural norms, there's not one single element that contributes to that. So regulation is one part of this, but also industry practice is another part of this. And then public attitudes and the role of civil society are a third part of that. So we're advocating on the regulatory front. We say there's a need for a new independent body, which we've described as an Office for Responsible Technology, which will oversee this and start to join up those dots. It will work alongside existing regulators, potentially recommend the establishment of new ones, to ensure that there is a coherent vision and connection and that the gaps in the current regulatory landscape are filled. But alongside that, we're working with business to develop a set of tools and practices so that responsibility is built into a product upstream, so that developers, business developers as well, policy marketers across a whole technology company, everyone is starting to consider how am I making this product responsibly? And then the third element is to build the public's understanding around how technologies work and the impacts that technologies have. So we want to move away from a focus on does the population have the skills to use technology to does the population have the understanding around the implications of using those technologies, because technologies are getting easier and easier to use, and almost as a consequence of that, they're getting harder and harder to understand. So we need an engaged and activist public, while at the same time not making it the public's problem to solve the issues that technology has created. Mm-hmm. So I think we need, it sounds like a big job, right? Sort of changing the whole structure of society across the piece. But technology is creating facts on the ground. And I think unless each part of society starts to realize the urgency of grappling with this change, and I feel very strongly we need to get to a point where essentially that we as a democratic nation state say, this is our vision for how we want, as Britain, how we want to shape technology and how we want technology to shape us. We are going to set the parameters within which this happens, rather than being reactive to technological facts on the ground which create a kind of whack-a-mole panicked response.
Anybody else want to chip in? Go for it, Steve.
In terms of what Catherine said, I think there's lots to agree with there. I think, obviously, coming from the regulatory perspective, we would very much argue that you build on the platform and the foundation that good regulation can provide. And I guess making the case for the GDPR, it only came into force in May of this year. And I think there are some really important concepts in the GDPR which should provide a very strong foundation for regulating the privacy risks which arise from the internet. So the concept of transparency is deeply embedded in the GDPR. The concept of control is as well. So the control of your own personal data through the rights, like the right to be forgotten or the right to access your own data and to have your own data in a portable format. And also the concept of accountability, which is really data protection by design and actually building in the consideration of the risks and harms from the outset. And I think that extends into a wider concept of safety by design. What our job is as a regulator is to make sure these things are actually translated into practice, which is why the sort of second phase for the ICO after the introduction of the GDPR is now working really with sector bodies, with trade bodies, with expert organisations to create another layer of guidance to show what this means in an operational aspect, to actually develop certification schemes so organisations can also demonstrate what good looks like, because it's very important, as Catherine said, for it to be translated out into practice. And equally around that, I think there is a wider sort of ethical sphere about responsibility and accountability, which extends out from the regulation. And probably there are some gaps there. Not all aspects of the internet are regulated in a way probably to the public's satisfaction at the moment. So that research we did with Ofcom about 21% of the population have reported a harm, a concern to a company online about an issue they've been concerned about. That won't just be about that data, it'll just be something about the scene that's upset them or concerned them, might be related to their children. So there is that wider space, but we're saying let's take the time for some public debate and research exactly what those gaps are and the right way to tackle it, because we know as a regulator as well we have to balance freedom of expression, and that's the other key challenge there that we've got to work on as well.
So whenever we have these kinds of discussions, or I get confronted with this kind of internally, there's always this, yes, but in that, very regulated environment where everybody's being watched and we're making sure that no harms are coming to people, et cetera, et cetera. What about the innovation? How do we drive the good uses of data? What is it that enables organizations to keep on innovating and developing new technologies? So in that future, how would that work, do you think, Andrew? In your ideal, for enabling as well as protecting?
I think that Steve and Catherine make some excellent points, and I think it's clear that we need both pillars of transparency and accountability. And there's a lot of fascinating design work to do in both spaces, thinking about how you actually make applications themselves transparent about how they use data and for what purposes to the application's users and society itself is a fascinating topic. And I know if a design agency in London have done some fantastic work in the space. I actually really like the work done by Monzo and Co-op Digital to make their kind of roadmaps public so that you can kind of start to get transparency as to what you're building in the future. I think the accountability part is one where we need to do a lot more thinking there. Mm-hmm. In particular, Steve mentioned the need to kind of give users control, and Catherine mentioned the difficulties as technology becomes more and more complicated, and those two things are at odds. Mm. And so we need better ways to help decide a society on how to make technology accountable, given that it is quite difficult to understand. And so I think there's been fantastic work done in Manchester by Connected Health Cities. So for example, when they started down the path of building a shared care record, they convened a citizens' jury where they got a sample of the population, and they spent 2 days educating the sample of the population about the pros and cons of what data can be used for. And then they themselves answered on behalf of the residents of Manchester what that data could be used for. And I think that is a fantastic model. And I think to your point around how we speed up innovation, I'm going to quote a fantastic compliance person we have working with us called Yutta, who talks a lot about brakes on a car, like why were brakes made on a car? The brakes were made on a car to allow you to go quickly. Like it's if you define the regulations that gives you framework to iterate and develop quickly in a safe space, then that can actually speed up. A lot of problems you see at the moment is kind of gray areas in the evolving rules around what you can and can't do and what society believes you can and can't do. And the sooner we get to a stage where we have inclusive and democratic ways to decide what is and isn't appropriate, the faster it is people can work towards that and actually speed up innovation.
So another kind of challenge that we often talk about is there's the degree to which you put choices on individuals to make choices about the way in which data gets used, and the degree to which you have these kind of fundamental protections, right? And I think there's also kind of the role of the individual within an organization that is using data. I wonder, Pat, if you'd reflect on that. In an ideal future, what kind of what's the role of the individual, both from a decision-making point of view for using the use of data about them, but also in organizations? What's that look like?
So people don't make good decisions. I've had experience with that, obviously. but generally, all of us, we're all irrational. We all generally don't work in our best interests. So again, from an evolutionary point of view, for example, it makes sense to consume as many calories as possible because we don't know when there'll be more in the future and we need to stock up. But now in the modern age, that's not so helpful because there's calories everywhere. And so in the same way, we're living in an age which is completely kind of new and alien to us, and all those heuristics which are kind of hardwired might not be so appropriate here. So people, of course, should have freedom, but at the same time, they should be what's known as nudged into making optimal decisions. So it's known as Libertarian Paternalism. So we're leaving people to be free to make their own choices, but at the same time recognizing that they might not always have the time, the effort, the kind of spare brain power to make the best decisions because it's effortful. And so you kind of put these mechanisms in place to kind of help them along the way to doing the best thing. So, for example, you may have seen, instead of traffic cameras, speed cameras, sometimes you see if you speed, you get a sad, frowny face, and if you go under the limit, you get a happy, smiley face. And that's effective, number one, because positive reinforcement is more effective than negative reinforcement. And number two, because you get the feedback immediately. You don't have to wait 2 weeks to get a letter. So I think there are certain things like that can be implemented to help people make better data decisions.
Interesting. Does that tie into the kind of things you were talking about design and the kind of design of interfaces?
Definitely. I mean, I think we're still at the early days of doing user research in this space. There is a tension between how much information you build into an application to present to people, how data is being used so they build a degree of trust and confidence in the application, until it kind of starts detracting from what the application is supposed to be doing in the first place. And I think there just has not been enough exploration in this space yet, and I think it's something that I'm looking forward to see in future.
I think it's one of those things where, you know, there's anything that's telling me that it's nudging me towards a particular behaviour, it immediately makes me distrust it all the more, right? It's when you tell me that you're manipulating me, I don't trust you. So,
yeah, but, I mean, essentially, a lot of these technologies are manipulating us without telling us,
yeah.
right? So, I mean, I think one of the interesting things in what you say is, you know, nudge people to make better choices, but better by whose definition? Yeah. And I think one thing that is absolutely not clear yet is who's getting to decide what better is, because at the moment, essentially, it's the platforms who take up most of our internet time and attention, who are getting to make those judgments. And as we have seen, those are not always very actually better by the standards of society as a whole. So I think we need to be very clear about who's deciding what good is and good for whom, because there's good for the individual. I mean, the point about speeding, the point of not speeding is not for the person who's in the car, it's for the society who's outside the car, right? So who are we protecting with this, and whose interests? Where are the power balances that we need to consider so that this definition of better decision is rooted in our common understanding and values?
Definitely. I think what's necessary, to quote, I think one of Doteveryone's phrases, we need to find some way to get society in the loop rather than even the people building software or individuals, because if you push it all the way down to individuals, that's not a great model for many decisions. It can't necessarily be the people building software either, and so we need to find new forms of governance that sit between those two things, that look at bringing society's interests first rather than the interest of any one individual.
I think we're at a really important stage as well, really understanding the human dynamics behind decision making. With the work we need to do on explainable AI at the moment, that is talked about all the time as being a really important component, and it's a piece of work we're starting at the ICO. We're going to work with the Alan Turing Institute on that. And I think to Andrew's point as well, actually, we're very interested in citizens' juries about not just doing like sort of, I guess, quantitative research, but also that deeper qualitative research with groups of users to really understand how they'll interact in different situations, to really build in that design and think about areas of nudging or default settings, how we actually explain decisions to people is going to be really important. But I think that will only be part of the equation, because I think the risks and harms are still the responsibility of the organisation, therefore that accountability point, and then to Catherine's words, who's got their back, we're aware as a regulator as well, there will be a responsibility sometimes for someone to go in behind the scenes, underneath the bonnet, and actually look at how the algorithms are designed. This is going to be a tricky area. At the ICO, we're just about to announce our first AI fellowship of someone we've got coming from academia to work with us for 2 years, and they're going to be working on explainability, but also an auditing framework for our investigators. The nature of our investigations and auditing's got to change. We've got to learn how to go inside companies or public bodies to actually look at how these things work in practice, and actually to decide and understand what bias looks like in an algorithm is a really tricky area. We'll work with the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation on that, but I think it's got to be a combination of empowering the individual and then a strong regulation behind it so that someone's got their back, and it's probably when those two work together effectively that we'll really start to get somewhere.
I think just to pick up on Stuart's point there, that there's obviously been tremendous amount of fantastic work in open standards for many different domains of knowledge, from transportation to geospatial data. I don't think anybody's really started on open standards for kind of audit and information flows, and it would be an interesting question to work with Steve and say, if we as a group of people building technology wanted to make it easier for Steve and his team to do his job, what would that interface look like? And if in deploying technology, we were required to give a feed of some data to the ICO, what would that feed look like? I feel a lot of the talk in this space gets drawn into the nonsense of blockchain. And the reality is that there is...
First mentioned today, I think. Go on.
Do I get a prize for that?
Yes.
I think the reality is there's a lot of really fascinating discussions there that have nothing to do with the technology, but to do with kind of what does society want to know about algorithms and bias and how information flows. And if we as practitioners can work to define standards in this space, as we all have on domain-specific knowledge standards, I think we could actually end up with something quite interesting.
Very good. Okay, so in the room, then we've got people from organisations, public sector, private sector. We've got people from China. We've got people from the US. We've got people from the EU. And they're people working in organisations that collect data, share data, they use data. And so I want to turn to kind of advice for the audience around trust. So Pat, you're forever associated with Cambridge Analytica. That's just who you are now. And obviously, we all know about ICO's ruling against Cambridge Analytica and against all that. From a personal perspective, having been in an organisation like that, is there anything that you would advise for people who are in organisations, maybe that are similar, or maybe that where they have doubts? So,
yeah.
What would you say?
I am a good person, by the way. Yeah, so be trustworthy is probably the first thing. Don't be evil, as Google used to say, because once it's lost forever. Rightly so. Don't do politics, I would say, as well. If you're a company, to stick to commercial stuff. But more generally, I would also say be transparent. My dad always used to say that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I think it's just good for businesses, but good for society in general, just to have that complete freedom of information. And also, if you're dealing with data, be fair. So I think there's a big power imbalance between consumers and businesses in that trust is giving people kind of control and trusting that they'll do the right thing, but I think consumers don't even have any control. I think one of the big surprises for me was how shocked people were that their Facebook data was being collected and used. Did they not know that? What did they think? They were just getting this platform for free? So I think consumers don't really understand, and they don't have that kind of control. So that should be given to them, and that can be paying people for their data, having data as a currency, just making it fair, I think. Not blockchain, though.
But not blockchain. Yeah, okay. But there's saying all those things about needing to be transparent, needing to be trustworthy, and obviously there's organisational kind of requirements on that. What about the people who are working within those organisations? What's the and maybe Andrew, you'd like to talk about this as well. What's the responsibility on the individual, do you think?
I mean, I think the responsibility on the individual when you're building or designing something is to think through the downstream consequences of what you're building. And I think that is it is definitely a change that I don't think it's thought of enough in terms of a design, but at that quite practical level. I think we are just at the early stages of giving people in technology the tools necessary to do that. So I think ODI have done some great work with the data ethics canvas that helps people think through that. IF have got design patterns for how to put transparency and accountability into your applications. Amidia have also published work in this space. So there's an emerging set of toolkits, and I think it's up to all of us who build technology on a daily basis to, when you are designing and building things, don't just come at it from the perspective of how do I build my application to provide value to that end user, but come at it from the perspective of, if I'm widely successful, what do I think of the downstream consequences of the thing that I've built is.
So sticking with the what should organisations and individuals in the room do, obviously, Steve, you're going to say adhere to GDPR, but is there anything beyond that you would say as a recommendation to retain trust?
Well, I mean, it is related to GDPR, but I think it's embedding it in the organisation in terms of what Andrew's talked about the skills and training and support that the different people need to make the right decisions, and that's still, I think, at a fairly early stage. We've got the concepts of data protection impact assessments in the GDPR. That's a concept which can be extended out to an ethical impact assessment, and I think it's making sure that, you know, the engineers, the designers are also aware of risks and harms, and this isn't the domain of lawyers. The lawyers clearly provide the key compliance advice and deal with crucial issues, and also the concept of a data protection officer is required for certain organisations who carry a certain risk level under GDPR in terms of how they use data. But the data protection officer should be reporting to board level in organisations. So I think that higher level awareness, and then a data protection officer who's going out and evangelising within the organisation, training people how to do impact assessments, how to learn how to assess privacy risks, and also just learning how to think about different ways around problems, because that's something I think we repeatedly see. There's only one way we can do it. The board says we've got to launch this project and we've got to go this way. But actually learning to think around problems to show that you can have innovation and privacy, and addressing the harms going together is the biggest challenge, I think.
And Catherine, what would you like to see the organisations in the room doing, like, after they leave?
Well, I mean, and I think the thing that none of us have sort of said bluntly so far is the reason there is a lack of trust is because companies have behaved in an untrustworthy fashion. And specifically, Facebook and Google have behaved in an untrustworthy fashion. And this is where people have such a big issue with what DeepMind is doing by pushing streams into Google. And, you know, you can split hairs about the way that you're doing it, but fundamentally people feel a breach of trust because we were told when you set up that this was not going to be a Google thing, and now it is a Google thing. Okay, that's essentially what the public understands. And so, you know, no shit, but you know, be trustworthy. and that, I mean, that has to come from so many points. You know, in the midst of Mark Zuckerberg's apology tour, and I spend a lot of time hearing, you know, platitudes from Facebook people about how terribly remorseful they are. I happened to have a drink with a guy who is developing VR for Facebook. And I said, so, you know, amidst all this, it's like very exciting times in Facebook, so how has your work changed? It hasn't. And I said, well, how, you know, come on, there's got to be some. He says, we just want to make great products. And it comes back to the point, great for who? So I think in terms of like what my takeaway bit of advice is, think very carefully about what your understanding of good is. Who is it good for? And is that something that you could explain to every person within your organization, to every person who is deploying your technology, who comes into contact with your technology? And can you articulate that? And I suppose that the test for me always is, could you tell your mum about this? Could you explain this to your mum? And would you feel a bit ashamed when you did so? Because I always think that is a pretty good test for whether, GDPR or no GDPR. If you wouldn't feel comfortable telling your mum, it's not okay, and you've got to think again. So think, when we talk about responsible technology, being responsible is having a very clear understanding of good for whom. And put that into practice, please.
So I think just picking up on kind of a piece of that, which is about, that there seems to me to be a distrust by association whenever you're associated with Google or whenever you're associated with Facebook. There's that kind of distrust by association. There's also the distrust that comes from saying that you'll do something and then doing something different. And did you have any kind of reflections on that, being from the DeepMind health perspective? Sorry to put you on the spot, Andrew.
I think it's completely reasonable that people are concerned about that move. I mean, it's completely understandable, and I certainly would never want any part of my healthcare data mixed with any form of advertising data, for example. Yeah. I mean, that is, I think, any single person on my team, to the point of explaining it to their mother, would feel exactly the same way. And I think that is something that we have committed to in the past, of never mixing those two worlds. Yeah. And I think that has to continue for two reasons. One is that I don't think anybody at the organization would continue working there if that ever changed. And secondly, which I think is a piece overlooked, I mean, trust is incredibly important and obviously one of the key issues. There is also the law, and we process data on behalf of organizations we work with, and we are completely beholden to what they ask us to do. And if we ever stepped outside those bounds, for example, using healthcare data to do anything other than provide services directly to clinicians, we would be in breach of those contracts and the law, and then Steve and his colleagues would very rightly come and hold us to account for that. And so I think those are the key things that you have to take in mind. But I think we do need in future, especially large organizations such as Google, Facebook, and others, have to think very carefully about their internal governance processes of how do you ensure that those rules are followed as things are built in future.
Cool. Right, so we're almost out of time, so I'm just going to ask you for one kind of tweet length takeaway that you would like the audience to take, starting from the end, and we'll work this way. Pat.
Don't be creepy.
Steve.
Build this into the organisation, make one person responsible for driving it, and then getting others to take responsibility throughout.
That was a bit over tweet length, but fine. Go, Catherine.
I would say don't make the public pick up the mess that technology has created.
Okay. Andrew.
Design for transparency and accountability.
Thank you very much. So can you give a big thanks to the panel today? Thank you so much.